You are now listening to another episode of Renegade Podcast. I'm with the one and only J.D. Barker. He's an author, he's a writer. He's written all types of novels, from horror to speculative fiction to mystery, neo-noir, and everything in between. I'm very excited about this. And it's going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. Hello!
Hey, there you are.
How you doing, man?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good, bro. The first question I want to ask is, I could see your new novel right behind you, is, how long does it take for you to, write a novel in the first place? Because, you got people like, George R.R. Martin, he has his own process, and, other people as well. How long does it take you to, write a novel in totality?
Are we actually recording right now? Because I didn't get any kind of message.
Yeah, we're recording right now. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. I've done so many podcasts where we get about 10 or 15 minutes in and the host realizes they hadn't hit the record button yet. So I just wanted to make sure. Originally it took I think my first novel, probably about 8 to 10 months. Now I've got it down to maybe 3 or 4. I've gotten pretty quick.
Yeah.
I read a lot of books with James Patterson, so he's pretty good at cracking that whip.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's an interesting answer. So I was funny because, I was doing a little research and I found that you wrote a novel about Dracula. And actually, I got the book, from the library, and I read through it, and I thought it was very, very interesting, very kind of new take on the character. How did you, when did that idea come into your mind to do a different kind of take on Dracula? Because that's a big kind of character, and with his own sort of baggage and history and interpretations, yeah.
Yeah, that was a daunting thing. I've been reading pretty much my whole life, but the first adult book I ever picked up, or what I considered to be an adult book, was Dracula. I had found it at a yard sale when I was 8 years old. It was 25 cents, and I picked it up. I didn't think my mom would let me buy it because I figured she'd think it was too scary. But she let me buy it. I took it home, and I read it, and it scared me half to death. And it's the first time I think a book has ever gotten an emotional reaction out of me. So I've been kind of chasing that feeling ever since as a reader and as a writer. Just trying to recreate that. But the book itself has always been a presence in my life. My very first book that I wrote for myself was called Forsaken, and it was up for the best horror novel of, I think it was 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. And I was at the Horror Writers Convention for that award ceremony, and I did a signing, and they sat me next to Dacre Stoker, who is Bram's great-grandnephew.
Wow.
We sat there for about an hour. I picked his brain about everything I could think of related to Bram Stoker. And he asked me a ton of questions on my history. And I had previously worked, before publishing my own books, I had worked as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So basically writing books for other people.
Yeah.
And he had a bunch of questions about that. But we talked for about an hour and then, kind of parted ways. And the next day he pulled me aside and he said, listen, I'm going to be honest with you. When we sat down next to each other, it wasn't an accident. My family has been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a while now, using Bram Stoker's original notes and journals. And with your history as a ghostwriter and a book doctor, we feel you might be the guy. And he asked if it was something I would be interested in doing. And I said, yes. You always say yes when somebody asks you a question like that. Yeah. And then we just started talking by phone. And I guess about a month or two in, he invited my wife and I out to a cabin that he had in the Carolina mountains. We were there for a couple of days. And on the second night, he disappeared for a couple minutes and came back with this big box. And he set it on the kitchen table. And it was literally everything that Bram had on his desk when he wrote the original Dracula. There were notes on laundry receipts. Part of the book was written in a daytimer, which makes sense because Bram Stoker, in real life, he was a theater manager. That was his day job. So if you think of a daytimer, you're plotting out a novel, 2 o'clock on Wednesday, Mina does this. At 3 o'clock, Jonathan does this. So it kind of makes sense from creating an outline standpoint. But it was he told me two things that really made me want to work on the project. The first was that Bram completely believed vampires were real, to the point where he had himself cremated when he died at a time in history when people just didn't do that.
Yeah.
But the second thing really got me. He said that Bram originally wrote he told me that you asked me where does Dracula start for me. I think that was the question. And it always started with Jonathan Harker on the train. The opening chapter is Jonathan Harker on the train.
Yeah.
That's actually page 103 of the original novel. The first 100-some pages Bram had written were very autobiographical and basically explained why vampires were real. And when he wrote Dracula, he tried to sell it as a true story. When he turned it into his editor read it, pushed it back across the desk, and said, "There's no way we can publish this." Because at the time, Jack the Ripper was active in London, so people were already on edge. Everybody believed in the paranormal and supernatural back then, so that was already another thing, and they just weren't willing to spring something like that on the world. So they told Bram, if we're going to put this out, we're taking these first 100 pages out, we're going to turn it into a fiction novel. And Bram agreed because he needed the money. He let him do it. But he really wanted to tell that original story about why vampires were real, who Dracula really was. So when Dacre and I sat down, we decided that we were going to recreate those first 100 pages, and that's what Dracul, that we came up with, is about. It's basically us telling the story that Bram wanted to tell.
Wow, that's crazy. That is remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my favorite part about that book is the author's note, because when you read the author's note at the end, we tell you how much of it is actually real and which parts are fake. Yeah. And the parts that you think are fake are actually the parts that are real, and that's what really gets you. That
is interesting. This is the first time I've heard someone say that. First of all, Dracula was supposed to be much longer, and the first 100 pages was written like it was actually it was autobiographical, it was real. That's interesting. My next question is, your latest novel is part of a series, 4MK thriller series. And my question to you is, when did you get the idea to do this series in the first place?
The original series or the prequels?
Just the whole thing. The whole thing.
Well, I knew early on. I had worked in the industry for a while, and I didn't want to get pigeonholed writing the same kind of book over and over again. I have so many friends that they write a good book, it sells really well, and before you know it, they have to write that same book but different every year for the rest of their career. I didn't want to get stuck doing that, so I made a conscious decision at the beginning. I was going to bounce back and forth between my two favorite genres, which are horror and thrillers.
Yeah.
So my first book was a horror novel. My second one, I decided I'm going to write a thriller. I always wanted to write a book about a serial killer. But I knew if I was going to take that on, I needed to do something different, in order for it to stand out in that world, because it's a very, very crowded space. So I came up with the premise for The Fourth Monkey. And in my story, the 4MK killer has been active in Chicago for about 5 years. Everybody knows who he is. He's all over the press. But the police are no closer to catching him than they were from at the beginning. But his MO is very well known. He basically kidnaps a victim. He chops off that girl's ear. He mails her ear back to her family in a little white box tied with a black string. And that's kind of how he kicks things off. Oh. So at the beginning of my book, I've got a guy who's crossing the street in Chicago. He's about to mail a little white box tied with a black string, and he gets hit by a city bus and killed. So the police, as soon as they get there, they realize this is our killer, but he's dead. He has no ID on him, so they don't know who he is. But because he had that box on him, they realize that he has another victim out there somewhere, and the clock is ticking. They need to find her because there's nobody there to feed her, nobody there to feed her or give her water, anything like that. Yeah. So they know they have to find her quick. So from the opening of the book, it was, it definitely grabs you, but I ran into a problem very early on. For a story like that to work, the killer needs to be present in the story, and my killer was dead. So how do I bring him back to the story? So I came up with this idea to create a diary. So the police find his diary on his body when they find, after he gets hit by that bus. And it flashes back to when he was 15 years old and basically starts to tell the origin story of where he came from.
Yeah.
So the book itself, The Fourth Monkey, jumps back and forth between present day and those diary entries, kind of giving you little glimpses of who he is. When I turned that book in, we immediately got a ton of interest. We got a film and TV deal almost right away. The publishers lined up, and it was about to go to auction. And my agent called me, and she said, "Listen, if you've got an idea for another book, I could probably get you a multi-book deal." So I quickly scribbled out a follow-up idea. Not sure if it was going to go anywhere or not. But she ended up getting me a 2-book deal with HMH, which is part of HarperCollins now. So I basically turned in the first book, started writing the second book. I got to page 500, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to tell the rest of this story with just one book. I would need to do 3. But I only had a 2-book deal with the publisher. So when I turned in the second book, I basically ended it with the words "to be concluded," knowing that I didn't have a publishing deal for the third book. And then I went ahead and wrote the third one. We turned it in, and they made a great offer on it, but I decided not to take it. I decided instead to indie publish the third title, because I took a step back and just looked at this from the business standpoint, and I realized, this big publisher has the first two books in the series. They're going to have to market those. If I put out the third one on my own, I can ride that marketing wave and sell copies based on that. So I put it out on my own. And the trilogy has been out there for, I guess, about 10 years now.
Yeah.
It's still selling incredibly well. It's still hitting bestseller lists all around the world. It's still coming out in new countries. It just got optioned for the fourth time for a feature or for a streaming series. Sylvester Stallone's company, Balboa Productions.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, so that's really moving fast. So from the original trilogy, it's always been doing well. But when I go on tour, when people put the books in front of me, they always ask me the same question. They want to know more about that serial killer. They want to know more about his life growing up. And in the books, I basically end those flashback scenes when he's 15 years old, and the murders actually start when he's 30. So I've got a 15-year gap there that I've never filled for anybody.
Yeah.
So when COVID hit, I was a couple books ahead, because publishers only let you put out like 1 or 2 books a year, and I write pretty fast. So I was a couple books ahead. I decided I'm going to try to write 3 prequels. I didn't tell anybody I was working on them. I didn't tell my agents, my editors. I didn't tell anyone, because I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to pull it off. And I honestly enjoyed it, because I was able to write the 3 books in complete silence. Nobody else weighing in. If I came up with an idea in the third book, I could go back to the first book and I could seed that idea. I could add a couple of things so that it plays out better. And I was just really able to fine tune that entire story. So when I finished up the 3 prequels, I called my agent and said, "Hey, I've got these," and she immediately wanted to know what we were going to do with them. I'm in a weird position. I've got my own publishing imprint at Simon and Schuster, so I can kind of put out what I want whenever I want on a domestic basis. But I've got foreign publishers all over the world. I'm in about 150 different countries.
Wow.
So my initial thinking was I was going to put out all 3 books on the same day, like release 3 hardcovers on the exact same day. But when we started talking to my foreign publishers, they all pushed back and said, "There's just no way we can do that. We need some time in between." So we decided on a 6-month time frame. So the first Scarlet Door, comes out this September. The next one comes out 6 months after that, and the final one comes out 6 months after that.
Wow, that's So man, that's crazy. That's amazing. I mean, so when you started out, becoming, an author, did you think that you have the career you're having right now, or did you always thought this was always gonna, be a inevitability at some point?
No, I mean, you never know. So many different things have to line up in order for this kind of thing to happen. I mean, I mentioned I've been working behind the scenes as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. I was working in finance during the daytime. That was my day job. I was the chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm.
Yeah.
And then I would come home at night and I would work on these writing projects, basically just to stay sane. And I wrote a bunch of memoirs for other people. I helped authors finish their fiction books. I helped, take fiction books that were mediocre and turn them into something that the publisher really wanted to put out. Over that time frame, I did that for a little over 2 decades. I had 6 different books that I had written that hit the New York Times list that all came out with other people's names on the cover. And that gets old after a while, but it basically told me a couple of things. It told me that I knew what I was doing, and that I could probably do this on my own if I wanted to. And my wife pulled me aside. She said, "Listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's find a way to make this happen." But at this point, I was kind of stuck because I was 40-something years old. I had a good job, and I had that job for a while, so we had all the trappings of it. We had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat, so our monthly expenses were pretty high. So I couldn't just quit the job because we had to sustain that lifestyle. So we realized the lifestyle was actually the problem. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned.
Wow.
We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh. We rented out one side to some tenants, and then we moved into the other side and lived off their rental income long enough for me to write that first book. And that was 2014.
Wow. That's a bold decision, because it's funny, because I see people do that and their lives are like in complete shambles. The fact you did that and you allowed yourself to become this sort of big name in the publishing world, because it's funny, because whenever I search your name up on Reddit or on social media platforms, it seems like most people love your work, and that's that's really cool to see. I think that art is its own kind of language. It's not a math equation. And I feel like with people like you, I always feel like there's hope that we're approaching a new kind of golden age of literature. Because I don't know if you heard of this person, but have you heard of Robert Jackson Bennett?
No.
Oh, okay, okay. All right, so he's a obviously he writes a lot of novels. He did this fantasy series that was back in like 2022. It was like he ran it for like a couple years, and the thing about that novel and your novels as well is that there is this intrinsic kind of like I feel like your worlds feel lived in a way that I don't think most authors can really attest to.
I think where that comes from, I've gotten really good at building characters, and I think that really comes from all the memoirs that I wrote.
Yeah.
Because to write a memoir, to give you an example, like I wrote one for a female politician. So I met her at her house. I stayed there for I think 3 days, and just interviewed her the entire time, recorded everything. She told me all the stories that she wanted in the book. Then I had to really get her talking and try to find the stuff she doesn't want to talk about, because that's what people really want to read in a book like that. And then I had to take all that information back to my house, and I had to write a book in first person from her point of view, basically her telling the story, because it needed to look like she wrote it. And I have done that so many times that, when I create a character, I'm basically dropping myself into the middle of somebody else's life.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of an important thing a lot of new authors overlook. A book is, if you do it properly, it should be like, somebody has been living their entire life, and all of a sudden a camera is thrown on them for your book, for that moment in time.
Yeah.
So it should never feel like you're seeing this person for the first time. It should look like you're getting a glimpse of them while, a lot of stuff has already happened in the past. All of a sudden you flick on that camera and you're watching them right now. And when that book is over, if they're still alive, their life is going to continue. Like, it should always feel like you're picturing a snippet of their life. A lot of authors just don't do that. I'm reading a book right now. People send me tons of books because they want me to blurb them. And a lot of these debut authors kind of start with the same thing. Like, this one starts with somebody waking up first thing in the morning with their alarm clock going off. It feels very much, contrived.
Yeah.
I have a book called A Caller's Game. Like, I start that one with a woman who's trapped in the middle of New York traffic trying to get to her job. Like, we start, at that moment trapped in her car, which is something we've probably all experienced at one point or another. But if you can, that's what makes it real, I think. Like, you have to just, look at it as if these are real people, and you're turning the camera on them at this particular moment for your story, and it needs to feel that way.
So it's interesting, you mentioned about, the thrillers that you're writing, the 4MK series. It's funny because you were describing the character. I feel I'm getting a lot of like Zodiac vibes, a lot of Seven, Fincher vibes in general. Was that inspiration, or was it something else?
I watched all of it. I read a ton of books about it, and I was in Florida at the time. I even went to a local prison, and I interviewed people that were in prison for murder. And I talked to as many people as I possibly could, because I knew I wanted to convey the mindset. I knew if I wrote those diary entries, I knew it was going to be in first person, which means I had to be in the killer's head, and it needed to be authentic in order to pull that off. And I think because of all that research, I think that's why I was able to do it. I treated it as if I was writing another memoir, but I took the lives of 50 different people and kind of combined them.
So when you're interviewing these people in the prisons, like, how was that experience like? Because I can't imagine, what they're kind of like. I can't imagine the thought process behind sort of those things.
It was pretty scary. I mean, because I'm a finance guy, and I was working behind a desk. So all of a sudden I'm checking into a prison and taking off my belt and my shoelaces and turning into my cell phone. Like, it's scary to walk into that environment. But as I sat down and started talking to these people, and first of all, like, anybody can do this. You'd be surprised, people that are in prison, like, they don't have a whole lot to do. So if you reach out and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you, most of them will say yes. But when I got there, as I did start to talk to them, I realized that they kind of fell into two different camps. We had the people who were essentially, sociopaths. Like, they basically committed this crime. They had no remorse. They liked to tell you about it. They enjoyed telling you about it, and they liked to see the reactions that telling you about it brought out in you. That was basically one set, and then the other set were people that had done something just as an emotional reaction. Like I talked to a husband who found his wife cheating and killed the boyfriend.
Ooh.
He's in jail for like the next 20, I think he got 30 years. So he's got probably another 15 or 20 to go. But like completely filled with remorse. Like he hated the fact that he did it. He destroyed all these lives over this one action. And there are people like that too. So I tried to find the commonalities between all of them and kind of pick the little pieces of it to create my own killer.
Wow, that's something. That is interesting. My next question is that you mentioned that you originally started out as like a ghostwriter, and it's funny you mentioned that because I'm a big fan of music and hip hop. There's this thing in hip hop that you have somebody else writing your songs. Essentially, you're not really an artist. In the literature world, like this seems more common. Kind of like, how do you like when someone comes up to you and say, "Hey, I want you to write a novel for me, but I'll get all the credit." Like, how do you feel about that initially?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's just another job, because I got paid really well to do it. I knew going in that my name wouldn't be on the cover. The very first one I did, was actually for a football player. I was on the field for a Miami Dolphin game years ago, and I won a contest, so I got to be down on the actual field with the guys. And while the game was going on, I walked to a player who's a very famous guy, and we just started talking, and I asked him if he ever considered writing a book about his life, an autobiography. And he said, "Yeah, it comes up all the time, but I don't have the time to do it. I'm a terrible writer. It's never going to happen." So ultimately, we kept in contact, and we struck a deal. His agent worked out a publishing deal for this guy, basically. So we're going to write an autobiography, and a publisher picked it up. He got a huge advance for it. We split the advance 50-50, and I did exactly like I mentioned with the female politician. I interviewed him, I got the stories out of him, and then I wrote that book in first person from his point of view, and that's what we ultimately turned in. So I knew going into that my name would never appear on it. It's not, if there's NDAs, I'm not allowed to really talk about who it is or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I think when you approach it and you understand that it's just a business deal, then it's worthwhile. And like those kind of deals can actually be very lucrative. So I encourage writers all the time to do it because it's a great learning curve and it's a great way to start bringing in money as an author. It's funny you bring up the music business because back in the early 90s when I first started in college, I wanted to be in the music business, and I was in South Florida, so I was surrounded by hip hop and rap artists and all this stuff going on, and it's exactly like you said, but like when you pull back the cover on it, at the end of the day, it's a business. So the record label is paying for all of this. And if you've got somebody who's never written a song before, but, has a good voice, has a personality, has the appearance to be able to pull off, there's a lot of pieces you need to have to become a recording artist. It's not just about writing the music. The music is almost the smallest of all these different things. It's like the least important.
Yeah.
But they would bring in, songwriters that were proven, people that had written hits before that knew what they were doing, and they would give them to these no-name artists. The no-name artists would record it. Their name would start to build. They would get bigger and bigger. And as they got to, their second album, third album, and they were involved in the process enough, then the record label started to trust them to write their own music because they knew that they were surrounded by it. And they saw how the entire machine worked. And they had a better understanding of it versus somebody who was just in their bedroom just writing what they thought was a hit song. But the world has completely changed. I mean, in today's world, you can record a song in your bedroom. You can put it up on the internet, and you can make it as a recording artist without ever even talking to a record label. So it's been completely flipped on its head.
That's interesting. You mentioned, NDAs, about, because obviously I don't know your NDAs and stuff. Like for somebody who hasn't been part of that business, right? Well, what advice would you tell them in regards to that?
I mean, if you want to write a book for somebody else, if you want to work as a ghostwriter, you have to understand that you're not going to be able to talk about it unless the contract allows you to, which is pretty rare. And you need to basically approach it that way because it can be frustrating. Like I mentioned, I had 6 different books that hit the Times list. Like when you walk into a bookstore and you see a book that you wrote, right there at the entrance, a big old stack of them facing forward, and your name's not there, like that gets frustrating. But it's a trade-off. I spent so many years doing that sort of thing. I mean, that's where I really learned how to write. I think if I would have started publishing books back in my 20s, I don't think they would hit as well as they're hitting today.
Yeah.
But I had so much experience, behind the scenes working with editors. Editors, it's funny because in today's world, if I write a book and an editor has some kind of problem with it, they'll call and they'll tell me what their issue is, but they sandwich it. They'll always tell me something they love about the book, then they tell me the one thing they actually want me to fix, and then they finish up the conversation with like 2 or 3 things they like about the book. They sandwich the bad news in between the good news. But when they bring you in as a hired gun to fix somebody else's book, they don't sugarcoat anything. Like they would flat out tell me this guy can't write dialogue to save his life. There's too much exposition. It's too wordy. You need to cut this. You need to cut that. And when you have those kind of conversations and you have enough of them, you really get an understanding of what the folks in New York are really looking for in a best-selling book. It's an education to me that was priceless.
Wow, that's a great answer. So has there been a book that you've written, but you just like, you know what? I don't like this book. I don't want to release it. I'm going to scrap it. Or has that never happened to you?
Oh no, I've got plenty of those on my computer that'll, they'll probably never see the light of day unless my daughter finds them after I die or something. I think most authors have to write probably about 500,000 words before they really figure out what they're doing. Because typically what ends up happening is somebody reads a lot, they decide they want to become an author, and then they sit down and they try to write a book, and they end up emulating whoever it is they read. So if you read a lot of Stephen King, you sit down and you try to write a book like Stephen King. Yeah. It's not going to sound like Stephen King. It's not going to be as good as Stephen King, but that's kind of the end goal in their head. But when you write a lot, when you hit like that 500,000 word mark, all of a sudden your own voice starts to creep in. And those other people that you've read, their style is kind of fall back to the wayside and your own style creeps out. And that's when you really, get to the point where you can start putting something out. I see so many people that kind of make the mistake these days because just like with the music industry, you can write a book, you can hit publish, and you can get it out on the internet to the world. You can do it all in one day if you wanted to. And what typically I see happen quite a bit is somebody will write a book, they query a bunch of agents, they get a bunch of rejections, and they just say, well, I can't get an agent, I'm just going to go ahead and put it out myself. What they should do is try to reach out to those agents and find out why they rejected it, because they rejected it for a reason. There's probably something wrong. And if you can get somebody to tell you what's wrong, there's a good chance you can probably fix what's wrong. Yeah. But they don't do that. They just put the book out there. It goes up on Amazon and, their friends and family buy it. They weigh in so they get, 10, 20, 5-star reviews from people that know them. And then all of a sudden the real readers find that book and they start, critiquing it for what it is. It needed to be proofread. It's got a plot hole. It's got this problem. It's got that problem. Yeah. And all of a sudden their average rating goes down to 2.5 stars. They drop to 1.5 million in the Amazon store and the book fizzles and dies. It's not going to go anywhere. And the problem when you do that, the internet lives forever. So if you write another book and it could be the best book in the world, maybe you figure out what you were doing wrong and you get it right. You send that off to an agent. The first thing the agent's going to do is Google you, and then they're going to see all those results on your first book, and they're going to realize the first book only got 2.5 stars, is not selling, and that's essentially your track record. That's who you are to them. So it's so much better. Like if you can get that feedback, you can figure out what's wrong, you can fix it, and then put it. You can still put it out yourself, but make sure that it's perfect. Like I really think every book needs to be a 5-star read before it leaves your desk. Like you shouldn't introduce it to the public until it's as good as you can possibly get it.
Wow, that's an interesting answer. Has anyone approached you to like write a screenplay for a movie?
Yeah, that's come up a bunch of times. I've got 8 different books in what I call various stages of Hollywood hell. So this one's got a director, this one's got a studio, this one's got a showrunner, this one just lost its director. At one point, I wrote a book called The Caller's Game. I had gotten a couple books already optioned before that, so I got a little cocky while I was writing. I was like, I was going to write something that they can't possibly film just to see what happens. So I blow up like half of New York in this book. Then the book came out, and then Ridley Scott's company picked it up immediately. They're like, oh, we can film this. It's just going to be expensive. Like, you can blow up a lot of New York, but it cost a lot of money to do it.
Wow.
So they had the book for a while, and then at one point they reached out and asked if I wanted to write the screenplay. And I had never done that. Book itself was basically as good as I could get it. I felt like there was nothing else that could come out. So when I wrote the screenplay, I didn't know what I could take out, which is why my movie ended up being 4.5 hours long. So in today's world, I leave that to the professionals. I leave it to the screenwriters.
Wow, that's interesting. So it's so interesting, right? Because like it feels like there was a time where like back in the day, this is like the early like 2010s, late 2000s, early 2010s. Like seems like every like popular YA novel was adapted, was fast tracked into a movie. Some of them did really well, like Twilight and Hunger Games. You can even count the Harry Potter movies in that equation, but some of them kind of floundered, like Maze Runner. Some kind of floundered, like you know, Percy Jackson. Some of them were in the middle, like, you know, Maze Runner. And it's, what were your thoughts during that time where it seems like these authors were writing these novels just to get a movie made instead of just writing it as its own kind of story?
Well, I think it feels that way when you're outside looking in. But when you think about it, you know, there's about 1 million books that are published every year. And when you break that down to how many movies are actually made, it's, you know, there's a handful, you know, like 20 to 50 or so feature films, you know, from big studios, you know, a bunch of indie stuff on top of that. But
Yeah.
you know, there's very few movies that are actually made, you know, when you tie that into the number of books actually being published. So I've had, you know, I've been really lucky. I've had a lot of stuff that's been optioned. I've got a lot of things in the works, but nothing's actually been filmed yet. You know, a lot of my books have been optioned over and over again. Like that 4MK series, this is its 4th option with Balboa. You know, it was originally picked up by CBS, and their, you know, Lionsgate had it at one point, but it never actually got made. I was talking to a friend of mine once, and he pointed out something that really made a lot of sense to me. He said, if you watch the end of a movie, watch the credits, you know, 5 or 6 minutes of all these names going by, and every person that's mentioned there had to be there in order for that movie to make it to the screen. If you take one person away, the whole thing kind of collapses like a house of cards.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is. It's like it's this perfect storm of people that have to all come together at the perfect time in order for that to happen. And you never know. Yeah, I mentioned I write books with James Patterson. He had a book he wrote with Bill Clinton called The President is Missing. That sold for, I think, $8 million, if I remember right, for the feature film rights. Showtime had picked it up, and they filmed 4 episodes. And, you know, so they were actively filming it, and then they pulled the plug. So you never know what's actually going to get to the screen. Batgirl is another example. I mean, a whole movie that's, you know, been filmed and it's in the can, and the studio decided to write it off for a tax write-off, you know, instead of releasing it. Like, it'll never come out, even though it's a finished movie.
Damn, that's interesting. So I'm always asked this question during my my interviews, and I always say this: who's the most famous person to say "I love your work" or "I like your work"? It could be an author, it could be a celebrity, it could be anybody in between.
I've been pretty lucky when it comes to that too. I mean, James Patterson read The Fourth Monkey early on, and he called it ingenious. You know, which hearing that from him is you know, pretty cool. Over the years, I've gotten to know him a little, you know, quite a bit. I've gotten to know Stephen King a little bit through emails and stuff like that.
That's cool.
And those two guys, you know, kind of hate each other, like on paper. And at one point, I wrote a book with Patterson called The Noise, which was basically his very first horror novel. And I sent it off to King, and King read it, and he actually gave us a blurb for the cover. So I kind of pulled the two of them together. So, you know, anytime you get an endorsement like that, though, out of one of those big names, it really makes you feel good. You know, I was on the phone with Patterson the other day, and he was telling me that my writing has just improved, you know, hand over fist since we started working together. And like, I've always thought it was pretty decent, but like to hear that from Patterson, you know, it means a lot.
Yeah. Wow. That's cool. That is cool. So, so Sylvester Stallone's production company, he's working on one of your books, and obviously, you know, when those things sort of happen, people always ask, like, is the author really creatively involved? Is he just a face on a poster kind of thing? So when these projects do eventually get, you know, in production, do you think you'll be involved creatively? Do you want to be involved creatively? Like, what's the take here?
I'm an executive producer, so like on paper, I'm involved. But what I'm finding is that they try to keep the author at arm's length. They don't really want us involved, which I totally understand, because, you know, when you're making a movie or you're making a series, you know, there's a lot of money at stake. They tend to work with people that they've worked with before. You know, so if you hire a director or a showrunner, they tend to bring in people that they know that they've worked with before, that work well with each other.
Yeah.
Because they can be together for a long time. It could be years after, you know, on some projects. So they don't necessarily want the author weighing in because these people already know how to get something done and over the finish line. So we almost slow them down.
Yeah.
The only difference, I guess, is when something like 4MK, like it's a very twisty series. There's a lot going on, and Sylvester Stallone's company optioned all the books in the series. So at this point, 6 different books. They haven't seen all of them because 2 of them are still on my computer through going through the writing process. So they've called and asked questions about the prequels, trying to figure out where I'm going with that storyline so that they can make sure they tie it all together properly and fully understand it. One thing I have noticed is, to give you an example, when Fourth Monkey was first coming out, I had a ton of phone calls with film studios because at the time, that was the big thing. Streaming hadn't taken off yet. And one of those calls was with Ron Howard's company and Ron Howard and his partner. And they started telling me everything they would have to take out of the book in order to get it into a 2-hour feature film. This storyline's got to go. This character's got to come out. Maybe we can combine these 2 people into one person. That sort of thing. And it makes you realize, just how much the book changes and why it has to change in order to get to the screen. You flash forward to today's world where streaming is so popular. Almost the opposite is true. They'll take one book and turn that book into a full season, and they ask people like me, what do you have that didn't make the book? Like what hit the cutting room floor? Because they're looking for material that nobody's seen yet that still ties into that IP.
Yeah.
I kind of prefer the streaming stuff better just because I feel like they can tell the story that I originally wanted to tell.
Yeah. Wow. That is interesting. So it seems like there is a lot of politics going on in the background with these adaptations. That's the feeling that I'm getting.
There's a lot going on. Somebody told me one time that the only thing that's actually yours as an author is that printed book, like those words on paper. Because even when an audiobook narrator, when they get a hold of it and they tell that story, now it's their take on your story, so it's already a little bit different. But when the film and TV guys get involved, they've got the full right to basically take that story and turn it into whatever they want. And you don't have a whole lot of say in it, and you have to kind of take a step back. It's almost like sending your kid off to college. You have to wish them well at the door, but take a step back as a parent and just hope that they're going to succeed because they're not going to be there for everything.
Wow, that's interesting. So my next question is a bit of a 2-part question because obviously you had obviously I don't know if you've ever been to this, but like how do you So what is your reaction when, comic conventions, fan expos, those kind of things, they reach out to you to like make an appearance, talk about your work? Like, how do you sort of deal with that? Do you pick and choose? You just say yes because you know what, this can get my name out there, public recognition kind of stuff?
I originally said yes to all of them, which is very tiring. You spend a lot of time at airports, a lot of time traveling, and a lot of time away from your desk, writing the next book, which is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I've dialed it back. I like my next book, For Scarlet Door, we're actually only doing one public appearance in the U.S. I picked one bookstore that was selling the books really well, and they rented it's a winery, like a wedding venue. So we've got about 300 people coming in. That's going to be my only appearance in the U.S. to support the book. And I honestly kind of like that better. So we'll see where it goes. But I'm in a lot of different countries, so I still have to travel. I'm going to be going to Netherlands. I have to go to Spain. I have to go to Germany. I've got a lot of other trips that are on the books, to promote that title. So it's there's still a lot of time away from home.
That's interesting. So, do you ever get recognized in public? And how do you react to that?
It happens occasionally. I mean, you can see me because we've got video on. Like I've got long hair. Like I just tend to look a little different.
Yeah.
It mainly happens though at writer events. Like where somebody expects me to be there. So some type of book conference. Then I'll tend to get recognized. Occasionally, like I live in a very small town. Pretty much everybody here knows who I am. It's a very weird thing. Because like people will come to my house, like I'll hire somebody to trim some trees in the backyard or something, and they'll Google me before they come out, and like I can always tell when they've done that because there's a certain look in their eye that's different than the person who has no idea who I am.
Yeah.
So usually it comes up very quickly, and once we break that ice, it's all cool. But it's a very weird dynamic.
It is,
Basically, somebody knows you, but you don't know them.
Yeah, it's interesting because the reason why I asked that question because. It feels like in sort of today's era of social media and celebrity and just known people, celebrity culture and all that stuff. It feels like there was a line between the audience and the actual artist, and now that line has been completely erased. So the audience has these sort of set of expectations and entitlement that the artist knows that they can't reach. There's a standard that they expect. They can't get to that standard. They can't give them what the audience really wants, right? Have you ever dealt
Yeah,
with that in your
it
work?
comes up all the time. Like I'll do a book signing or event somewhere. And years ago, like if I did that, I'm basically talking to the couple hundred people that are in the audience, and that's it. But in today's world, when I look out over that audience, a good third of them have their hands up in the air holding their cell phone, and they're either recording everything or they're live streaming it or they're doing something. I've got no idea who is on the other side of that lens, who else I'm talking to. It tends to make me very guarded. Like I don't necessarily have as much fun with those conversations as I might have before, because I don't know who I'm speaking to anymore. It takes a lot of the fun out of it. I never understood why people do that. If you go to see somebody or you go to see a concert, why are you watching that through your phone? When you've got the actual person, you've got the live event unfolding in front of you, but you're staring at this little screen instead.
Yeah.
I really think we all need to get better about just leaving our phones in the car, leaving them at home, and actually enjoying life when we go out the door.
Yeah, that's a great answer, man. Because it's funny, because like it feels like there is this sort of counter economy of people trying to get other people angry because they themselves are not fulfilled for whatever reason. And I'll give you an example. I don't know if you're on Twitter like that. So obviously, the MCU, they're casting the X-Men as we speak, and there was a name that was rumored for Cyclops, and it's a guy named Cooper Hoffman. He was part of The Long Walk, and you know what I'm saying? And it was just a rumor, and people got so angry. People were like, oh, he's not handsome enough. Oh, he's not this, it's not that. And I'm just like, what? Like, this is kind of crazy, man. What is your reaction to stuff like that?
No, it's out of hand. I read an interview with Tom Holland about 2 weeks ago, where they did that with the new Spider-Man movie. They showed it to just regular fans, and then they got notes from those fans when they were coming out of the theater. And then those notes went back to the director and to the studio. And they considered actually changing the movie, based on that feedback. And like that's got to be so frustrating, to have some random person just kind of weighing in, on something that you created. I don't understand any of it. I really wish the studios didn't listen. In like the case that you just mentioned, 50% of the people probably hate the guy. The other 50% like him. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. He might do a fantastic job, but like it should come down to what he's actually going to, is he qualified? Does he fit the role? Does he fit the part as, the people that are paying for this movie, like the way they see it?
Yeah.
I think that's who needs to make those decisions. It shouldn't be the audience.
Yeah, you're right. Also, a second part to that kind of question is there's been a rise of conspiratorial, content, just thinking in general, right? It seems like everybody's kind of lost trust in each other, and even at the people that they watch and stuff. Have you ever come across somebody that thought you were a part of some kind of group or some kind of, how can I say this, like secret society? Like, have you come across something like that or no?
People make up stories all the time. People say that they know me, say that that they know this, they know that, and then they do that for everybody out there. I don't understand why somebody would do that, but those rumors do spread. I don't believe anything at this point that I see or hear online. Even in the media, if I turn on the news, I believe maybe 50% of what I'm actually seeing.
Yeah.
Because everybody's got their own motive for saying whatever it is they're saying. And you really have to look at that motive, I think, to decide whether or not they're telling you the truth. But I think we've all gotten jaded. I don't think anybody believes what we see in the media anymore. We don't believe what we see in social media. Every talking head on social media, there's somebody behind them telling them what to say, or they're saying it for a particular reason. They want to get likes and clicks and follows.
Yeah.
That's the real reason they're in front of you. It's not because they're trying to convey some, great truth that nobody else knows. They want the attention.
Yeah, that is interesting. Have you ever, obviously you've been in the, book industry, for the last decade plus, I think. And have you ever come across somebody like an executive or even like a fellow like writer that felt kinda like you didn't get good vibes from, for whatever reason, or that has that never happened to you?
I think it happens to all of us, right? We basically judge somebody the second that we meet them,
Yeah.
and then we listen to what they actually have to say. I try to keep an open mind to absolutely everybody, but at the same time, I'm very guarded because you never really know what somebody's agenda actually is.
That is a good answer. So, what does the future look like for you in terms of just writing? Like, obviously, you got the prequel stuff still going on. After that, do you have like a plan, or are you just taking it like step by step?
No, the publishing industry moves very slow. So when I turn in a book, it's usually about a year and a half before it actually comes out. So I've already moved on to other things, past that. Right now, I'm working on a new book with Patterson. I think that's book 7 or 6 or something like that for the two of us. We've been doing this for a while. I've got a whole line of co-authored titles that I'm working on with other people that I really enjoy. I've got a few solo titles that are already lined up in the pipeline. I've got books on the schedule, I think, right now until 2035. So it goes out pretty far.
Wow. Wow, that is something. Have you ever thought about like directing something? Yeah.
No, I enjoy writing the books. I think when I got that glimpse when I wrote the screenplay, I realized that like that's not the life that I want. I like writing the stories. I like writing the books. I like handing it off to somebody else who wants to direct. Somebody who wants to write a screenplay.
Yeah.
It's always best to surround yourself with the best of the best. And if you're doing something as a side gig, it's not going to be your best effort. Whatever your true job is, that's your best effort. So when I hand something off, I want to make sure that I'm handing it off to somebody where like that's what they want to do.
Yeah. Interesting. Who's the most famous person you can call up on your phone? Like, you can call this number and they'll respond.
Patterson probably, just because he always seems to be sitting by his phone.
Oh, that's a good answer. Next question. So obviously, our environments, they influence what we do on day-to-day basis. Growing up, does your experience of like growing up, back in the day, does that influence your writing at any kind of point, or no?
I think it does to a certain extent. Like I grew up without a TV in the house, so I was reading at a very early age, and I've never had any formal training in writing. My only training has been from reading, but I picked up on the actual structure of a book. Like people have told me, you can take like all of my books and drop them into a 3-act structure. So that framework is there, but I'm never conscious of it. I know that how to do it because I've seen it so many times. If that makes sense. So I think from that standpoint, I think the environment definitely plays a role. I think every experience we've ever had kind of shapes what we do and what we're going to do. So I think that's part of it too.
Wow. So your author name. When did you decide to make that your author name? Because obviously there's been people that use pseudonyms and code names and just completely fabricated names to get their sort of name on the book. Like what made you decide that, J.D. Barker, I'm going to put this in front of every book that I ever going to write?
One of the things that I do with a lot of stuff, like even when I have covers for a book, a lot of times I'll put them up on Twitter if I've got 2 or 3 different covers, and I'll just put the books up there with a question. If you were to walk into a bookstore and buy a book based solely on its cover, which of these 3 would you pick? Whatever wins that poll is typically what we end up using for the cover of the book. So when I was first writing my debut novel, Forsaken, I went up on Twitter and I put all the different versions of my name. My full name is Jonathan Dylan Barker.
Yeah.
So we put Jonathan Dylan Barker, we put Dylan Barker, we put Jonathan Dylan, we put J.D. Barker, we put all these different things up there. J.D. Barker got like 80% of the votes on that particular poll. So it was a no-brainer from that point on.
Oh, wow.
But I had been known like pretty much like I grew up with, when your first name is Johnny, you grow up with a lot of other Johnnies like in every class, like it was such a popular name. So people have been calling me JD for a very long time.
Yeah. Wow. That is interesting for sure. What was the book that made you fall in love with books in general?
Well, Dracula is the one that really got me going. My all-time favorite book is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens.
Oh yes.
I absolutely love that one. But I think Dracula is what really kickstarted it for me. Because it just, it brought out that reaction in me. Then after that, I started seeking out horror novels. I found Stephen King, devoured everything that guy had ever written, and went down that path. So I think, it's a combination of Great Expectations and Dracula.
Mm. Have you ever thought about writing like a completely different novel in a completely different genre? Like, have you thought about doing something like, more sci-fi heavy or more like autobiographical or whatever?
I haven't yet. I learned very early on, like if you go to my Wikipedia page, I think it sums up my writing best. It says I'm a suspense author who may include elements of sci-fi, of horror, of this or of that. So suspense is the common thread in my books. I know if I write a book that has suspense in it, then I can go out and I can include elements of science fiction or include elements of a Western or something different.
Yeah.
Which I've done. But like suspense has to be there in order for the audience to come along for the ride. I don't think I could write something that's completely different from what I'm doing now. I mean, it might be fun to try it just to see if I could, but it would probably wouldn't sell because that's not where my audience is at.
Interesting. So obviously, the bestsellers list is always a very kind of interesting sort of thing to look at. And how do you feel? How do you react when you see your name and the book you wrote on that list? And these lists are like, there are a lot of like heavy hitters are on that list, usually on a year-to-year basis. How do you feel when you see your name on those kind of lists?
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's validation. But so far I've hit the New York Times list. I'm not even sure how many times, but I've never gone higher than number 2. Wow. So like I'm still shooting for that number 1 slot. So I think that's kind of the way I look at it at this point. Like it's cool to hit the list, but I've already been there, done that. Like I'm always looking for like, how do I do something better?
Yeah.
So I need to hit that number 1 slot. I think last time it was Rebecca Yarros that kind of blocked us. She was at number 1 with Black Onks, I think it was. Yeah. So we had to hit number 2. But I mean, it's great to see it, as an author, like, when you work so hard and you see a book, rise to that level, it's fantastic.
Do you deal with writer's block? And if you do, how do you get past that?
I haven't yet. I'm pretty good about like my writing process. I've got a couple different books that I'm working on at any given time. So if I get stuck on one, I'll just put it aside and I'll work on another one. And in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking about that first one, working out whatever problem I had with it. I think the only time I've ever experienced anything like writer's block, when I was very first starting out as a full-time author, I used to just sit down and just write as much as I could every day. And I think I had one day where I had 6,000 some words that I wrote. And like by the time I finished that, it felt like I had run a marathon. Like I just, I was squeezing water from a rock. Like I just didn't have anything left in me. And the next day when I sat down to work on that book again, I stared at a blank screen for a couple hours before I could get going again. Because I put it all on the page the day before.
Yeah.
So I think I realized at that point that I have to pace myself. So in today's world, I write 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. And I will stop mid-sentence. If I hit 3,000 words, like that's my cutoff for the day. I will stop in the middle of that sentence and I'll go on and start doing the rest of the things I need to do for that day. The business side of it, talking to agents, answering emails, that kind of thing.
Oh.
And I find that if I stop mid-sentence, I already know what's coming next. So when I sit down the next day to write, I basically just pick up right where I left off and I hit the ground running and just keep going.
It's interesting you mentioned agents, because obviously there's been this trend of like agents, they demand this percentage of this person's image rights and stuff like that. Have you dealt with that?
Yeah, well, before we go there, I just have to tell you I've got about 3 minutes and I need to go to get on my next call.
Okay.
So I'm going to have to jump off unless you want to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Every agent typically takes 15%. That's the norm. Foreign agents, foreign representation, they'll sometimes take a little bit more. It might be 20 to 25%.
Yeah.
But it should never be more than that. There's industry standards there that govern that kind of thing.
Oh, wow. My last question to you is, what advice would you give to up-and-coming authors trying to write that first book?
I always tell everybody the same thing, and it seems silly, but you have to write every day. I really feel that like writing is almost like going to the gym, like you work out a writing muscle, And if you work on it every day, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And if you take a couple of days off, it gets weaker. If you write every day, all you have to do is like 200 to 300 words. That's a full novel within a year. I think anybody can do that. I was working 60 to 80 hours a week in the corporate world, and I would still come home and at least get those 200 to 300 words. So I think that's a good starting point. The other thing I always tell everybody is you're going to hear no a lot. A lot of people are going to say no to you. They're going to turn down the book. They're going to turn down you. Whatever it might be, you're going to hear no way more times than you hear yes. You have to get used to that as well and just get back up and just keep going.
Okay. Yeah, that's the end of the interview. I really, really appreciate you coming on. And I think we showed some great chemistry during this conversation, man, so I'm rooting for you, man, whatever that show comes out of your series, I'm going to be tuned in, locked in right
All right,
there.
well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, it was a good conversation.
Thanks for the interview. That was fun.
You too. Bye.
All right, later.
Later. That is another episode of the Renegade podcast. And I hope you guys enjoy this one. Stay away. Enjoy this one. Put this one together. Bye.